I've been reading up on and watching videos about how continents formed and have transformed over time. Earth's geological history is mind-boggling. It's hard to comprehend how long this planet has existed, or how it even exists, how it supports life, and how this life continues to evolve. This sense of wonder and awe is something that has inspired countless stories about Earth's origins from just about every human civilization. Each of these stories reach for, but don't quite fully grasp the facts and the truly fantastic nature of the matter. Not that any discipline, scientific or otherwise, has. Such stories are called creation myths. Creation myths are the first geological myths in the true sense of the word, even when the actual accounts speak of things like eggs and flowers rather than rocks. Creation myths also address the most fundamental questions of human existence. How did we get here? And as they answer this question, creation myths also provide reason for the other fundamental question of human experience. Why are we here? In this way, they structure the experience of living. There are hundreds of creation myths. And yet, if you ask the average African, you will most likely hear the biblical or the qur'anic version. And that was certainly the case for me growing up. To the average Cameroonian from the Christianized part of the country, the biblical account of creation is what is presented as the uncontested version of how all things in the universe came to be, and this is settled as a truth. I don't imagine it's much different for people from the majority Muslim northern part of the country, where the Quranic version of creation is presented as the most truthful account of how all things came to be. And so for the month of November, on the Mythological Africans podcast, we will take a closer look at African creation myths and probe, lightly as always, at what they reveal about what the people who believe in them understand about the forces and processes that move and organize their world. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Mythological Africans podcast, where we read and talk about stories from African mythology and folklore. I am your host, Helen Tunde. Before we look at specific examples, though, it's worthwhile to spend some time on the ways creation myths have been analyzed. You see, when anthropologists and ethnologists started looking at myths and folklore from around the world and comparing them to each other, they found similarities in certain ideas and themes. Enough similarities that they have been able to broadly classify creation myths into 5 distinct categories. Ex nihilo creation, which means creation out of nothing, usually by a supreme godlike entity. Creation by emergence, in which all that exists seems to emerge from under the earth or out of some body of water. Creation by world parents, in which all that exists is born out of the union of 2 cosmic entities, one usually male and the other female. Creation from the cosmic egg, in which all that exists emerges from an egg, and creation by earth divers, in which a cosmic entity dives into the primordial waters and secures a portion of the earth. What is really cool is that there is at least one example of each of these kinds of creation myths from all corners of the African continent, and in some cases the same myth has 2 or 3 of these different aspects of them in it. Now, fun fact, before I started curating Mythological Africans, I worked on a pet project where I looked at mythology, folklore, and culture from Cameroon, my country of origin. I figured before I started poking into the business of other African people, I should have a good enough grasp of what the deal is in my own country. And if you've been with Mythological Africans for a long time, you've probably seen some of the results of that project. If not, I'll include links in the episode notes. The very first thing I did for that project was to look at creation myths, and I have to say I wasn't disappointed in what I found in Cameroon. I think I found an example of every single type of creation myth somewhere in the country. And you have to understand how hyped up this got me. I literally had no clue any of these stories existed, which is sad considering I was in my 30s when I started working on this project. And so that really speaks to the miseducation around mythology and folklore that exists in the country. And I hope that's changing. I think it is, but I hope it is. Mythological Africans is part of the effort to change that. So there is that. And that is the joy, right, in creating this platform, because I get to feel this thrill of new discoveries, and then I get to share them with other people. So what I'm going to do to wrap up this intro episode, because this is an introduction, we've found out what the different kinds of creation myths are. And for the rest of the month, we're going to go category by category and look at examples from different parts of the African continent. But before we do all of that, I'm going to share two of my favorite Cameroonian creation myths. The first one is the creation myth of the Balinyonga people. And the Balinyonga are a people from the northwest region of Cameroon. They are one of the country's most well-known peoples, and historically they were a powerful kingdom, so they have a well-articulated oral and material culture. They've also produced some of Cameroon's most prolific scholars. The creation myth of the Bali starts with Nikop, the supreme being, and Nikop created the world out of nothing and then let it fallow for some time before returning to plant seeds. Now, these seeds germinated and grew into trees of different sizes, but certain trees were special. And so Nikop chose to live in them so that he could assess conditions in the world and see what was possible for the next phase of his creation efforts. And when he felt it was suitable enough, Nikop created all kinds of animals, some of which evolved into humans. But some of the seeds Nikop planted, as the story goes, fell in parts of the world where the conditions were hot and hostile to animals and humans. And he waited and waited and waited for conditions to change, but they did not change. So he went ahead and created these plants and animals out of that heat. And so the humans who evolved out of the animals and that part of the world, they have fire in their skin. This myth is an example of ex nihilo creation, and so we have Nikop creating something out of nothing. Another myth I quite like is the creation myth of the Batanga people in the littoral region of Cameroon. And this region is named the littoral region because it borders the Atlantic Ocean, so predictably water plays a major role in this Batanga creation myth. And the story starts with a vast body of water about which three sky gods, Mabea the Noble, Mabea the Laborer, and Mabea the Silent, were very curious. Mabea the Noble and Mabea the Laborer made an axe with which canoes could be built to navigate the water, but there were no trees from which they could make the canoes. Now, creation myths are not known to be logical, so let's just go with the story. So they asked Mabea the Silent, who could see beyond what was observable, to go into the primordial waters and see what was out there. Mabea the Silent transformed into a fish and went exploring, but he found nothing particularly interesting except for a white spot. And so he came back and reported his discovery to the others, and they returned to the spot after 7 days to see what it was. And to their surprise, it had transformed into a marsh. Mabea the Laborer put 3 stones from heaven on the spot to make it less marshy, and those stones became earth. There was, however, no vegetation or people, and so Mabea the Noble gave Mabea the Laborer a seed to plant. And this seed germinated into a creeping plant which grew to cover the whole surface of earth and then transformed into other kinds of plants as it spread. But something was still lacking, and they knew what it was when Mabea the Silent spoke. "What we lack on this earth now," he said, "are inhabitants." And when he spoke, Mabea the Noble had an idea. "Go and cut a branch of the creeping grass," he told Mabea the Laborer. And when the laborer cut the plant, it started dripping sap, and everywhere the sap touched the ground, different kinds of animals and humans emerged from the spot. This is an example of earth diver creation where the primordial waters and one or more entities dive into water to secure a portion of earth. There are a couple more Cameroonian creation myths that I quite like, but we'll stay with these two for this episode. Before I go though, I want to comment on a few things about these two myths. The Bali creation myth is made hilarious when you consider the story of Eugene Zingraf, the German explorer who reached the Bali Fundum before any other European explorer arrived. And as the story is told, when he arrived, having trekked through the forest and in tropical climate, he was so hot and flushed from the heat, he was red, as white folks tend to be when they are in hot temperature. So he was so red and hot, the people were afraid to touch him. By some accounts, children ran away screaming when they saw him. And so it ties into that idea that some people came from a part of the world that was too hot and hostile for regular people to come from. And I think that this is an example of a story that was amended to include new knowledge. And you see this happen a lot, not just on the African continent and around the world. You have people who have an understanding of their world, and then something happens to change that understanding or to expand that understanding, and you see this new knowledge woven into their myths and folk tales. So you think about the fact that sunburned white folks were not a thing for these people. They were a novelty, so they had to figure out a way to explain them. But I also think that the characterization of Europeans as people created in an environment that is hostile to plant and animal life was probably an attempt by the storyteller to explain the difference between industrial era Europe and African societies of the time. And if you look at the historical context, I think that makes sense. But this is me speculating, so put me with that in mind. Also, Nicop created the world and then left it to fallow. And this might be representative of the Bali people's understanding of agricultural cycles, because they were and still are an agricultural people. And in most agricultural cycles that understand land use, you plant, you cultivate, you harvest, and then after a while you clear off the land and then let it sit for a cycle or two so it can refresh and regenerate. And so Nicop preparing land and then letting it fallow for a while before coming to plant trees and letting things evolve might reflect that understanding. But then there is also the fact that Nicop chose to stay in trees to assess the land's readiness for other life forms. And again, for forest adjacent people like the Bali, this makes sense. Groves of healthy and thriving trees, after all, are a sure indication that a place is fertile and suitable for other kinds of life. I am also intrigued by the value the Batanga people apparently place on labor, nobility, and silence. You don't assign qualities like that to the most powerful entities of your cosmology for no good reason. But it kind of makes sense though, because if you look at values that have been embraced by many African people, hard work, of course, for better or worse, is one thing, integrity is another thing, and verbal continence is yet another one. Matter of fact, amongst the Tuareg are the desert-dwelling people. Part of the reason why the men wrap their heads in all those veils is to cover their face, but also to remind them to keep their words to themselves, to keep their words minimum. So staying silent, holding your words, only speaking when you have something important to say is yet another important African value. Not that you can see that evident in certain circles today, but that's just my opinion. So there is also the curiosity that these entities had about the large body of water that they had in their vicinity. And this might be representative of the people's curiosity about the ocean on whose shores they lived. But there's also a part of me that wonders if this myth, this particular Batanga creation myth, is a recollection of an ancient seafaring expedition by canoe, during which a new island was discovered. But this is pure speculation. Finally, I really like that both these stories feature the aspect where human and animal life emerge from trees or are closely tied to trees. And this has no basis in biological reality, right? Kingdom Plantae is categorically distinct from Kingdom Animalia. However, I think this demonstrates the innate understanding that most, if not all, indigenous societies have, that animal life is inextricably linked to and dependent on plant life. We'll stop here for the week, but there is so much more to explore on this topic, so come back next week for more creation myths from across the continent. But if you cannot wait, go ahead and get yourself a copy of my book, The Watkins Book of African Folklore, because the first section is fully dedicated to creation myths and foundation legends from the continent, and each chapter comes with commentary. Thank you as always for listening, and I'll see you next week.